Well, welcome everyone. We are very glad. We're excited about
so
this. We've been
glad.
talking about it for the last week or so. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Brad, and I am the lead pastor here, and happen to be a boomer.
You do.
Yeah, I'm old.
You're a
is what I'm
baby
saying.
boomer.
There we go. And this is my sidekick, Jordan, here. He's our online pastor, does an amazing job with all our content and things like that. And you are one of the many millennial. I can't even say it.
I'm one of the last millennials.
Millennials.
Of my
You're actually a
generation.
young generation, a young millennial.
Yeah, I was born in 1996, which was the first cutoff. Then they moved it back to 98, I think. But
Yeah.
it's 96 is the cutoff. But anyway, we share that, like Brad said, because the whole heart behind this podcast is for us to have honest conversations from a generational approach,
Right.
where we can really just talk about some difficult things, but because we have that respect for one another, we're able to have those tough conversations.
And I don't think there's ever been a time in the culture that the generations have been so different.
Oh, for
and
sure.
I think that's why society they're just and there's a lack of respect to some degree.
Absolutely.
On both ends,
Absolutely.
from boomers to millennials, millennials to
and
boomers.
that's part of where the divide has come.
Exactly. But even when I think back when I was growing up, this wasn't talked about. I mean,
Right.
there were some differences between generations, and you rolled your eyes at
Right.
But because of technology, I think is where
Absolutely.
you can see where the shift has come, and it's a totally different culture, if you will, from these generations to the older generations.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with that. It's just the way it is.
And then I think when you get to Gen Z, I think Gen Z just doesn't like either of our generations. So I think we've got the butting heads of us.
It's
two.
crazy, isn't
and then
it?
Gen Z just does stuff so differently because they have never known a time without technology.
And Generation Alpha is coming right behind
Right.
them, and it's
Right.
just a crazy time. And for us old folks, it is hard for us to understand what is going on. So
Absolutely.
that's what we're
Yeah.
going to be tackling more and more of in this podcast.
Yeah,
as
we want
do
to
this.
create a safe space because as the church, we are both pastors and we are a church podcast. As the church, we believe it's so important that we have a safe place to be able to wrestle with difficult things.
Right.
And so creating a platform where, because we both have, respect for one another and because we both care deeply about our generations, but then also reaching other generations.
The next generation's coming
it's
up.
so important that we create that platform to be able to talk about those things.
Right.
So, Susan Keys, hello, welcome to the chat. So tonight, for the season 3 kickoff, we're going to be talking about that was a bad drum roll.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Marriage ... question mark. And that's the topic. So here's the heart for
And this could be about 5 podcasts probably, so we're not going to
my
get through
goodness.
anything tonight.
No, we're just going to really go on a few rabbit trails and talk about the generational differences in views of marriage, sex before marriage, living together but not married. Why would we get married when we act like we're married? That question, divorce differences and generational, the church's idolatry with marriage, get a ring before spring, all of those different things.
The ring before spring.
The ring before spring was a huge thing at AU, at campus,
Right.
and at North Park.
Yeah.
And so pretty much what we're going to do is we're just going to share our hearts. We're going to wrestle with some tough stuff. We're going to talk about some difficult things and probably laugh along the way.
And there you go.
Yeah. So
All right.
Brad, why don't you share some
Yeah.
stats about marriage?
I love this. Some of the stats here. And we talk about this as baby boomers view the point of marriage as fidelity. I actually had to look that word up.
Fidelity.
Yeah.
I think you're saying it wrong. I think it's fidelity.
Fidelity?
Because it's infidelity. You don't
Infidelity.
say infidelity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm thinking of the investment firm
Marissa,
Fidelity.
hold on. My wife said that was the worst drum roll ever. All of you know I worked all night on
All
that
that,
drum roll.
all that.
Okay, carry on.
So it's about staying together at all costs and things like that. That's basically fidelity.
Right.
All right.
Faithfulness and
Exactly.
etc. Yep.
And millennials view the point of marriage as happiness.
Yeah. So boomers view the point of marriage as fidelity.
Yeah, talk about that just a little bit because I would suggest that, and maybe this is creeped into, but you hear a lot of. We're going to talk about divorce here in a second. You hear a lot of even older boomers and Gen Xers saying, "Well, I'm just not happy anymore, so
Sure.
I'm going to quit this and start something else."
Sure, yeah. And for millennials, I actually think it's the same thing with jobs too. Like, well, I want a career and a job that I'm happy in rather than something that just pays the bills, something that's a faithful, committed paycheck. I think it's the same with marriages. Well, like the boomers are like, well, I just want a faithful, something consistent marriage. And the millennials like, no, I just want to be happy.
And in our jobs, we say we'll stay here.
Right,
We're not
we'll
going to leave.
suck it up.
We're going to suck it up because it is paying the bills.
Right, but the marriage, and so it's the opposite with the millennials, where they're willing to, they are more willing to find a job that brings them joy and maybe pays less.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times that leads to not having a job. So all that fun stuff. Okay.
So go on. By 1960, 65% of traditionalists ages 18 to 32 were married, compared to 26% of millennials
At the same
in
age in
2013 who were married by those same ages.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest differences with marriage.
65% to 23%.
Is you were saying that it was very uncommon to be 25 and not married.
If you were 25 and not married, you were probably going to be single the rest of your life.
That's crazy.
I mean, yeah.
Because if you're 25 and married now, like you're getting married young. Like people aren't even thinking about having kids until they're 30, 32.
And I honestly think there's probably some benefit to that.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I think especially with how our culture is set up, and with college and debt and stuff.
Which brings us to the next. And see, there's even more debt now with you guys than what it was in my generation.
It's more expensive and stuff.
Baby boomers divorce much higher of a rate than any other generation. Of course, the other generations, if you're not married, it's hard to divorce.
Right, and that's part of that's why the stats a little skewed, because my generation just isn't getting married. We're just living together and sleeping together.
Yeah.
But we're not, tying the knot.
Exactly. So my guess is if you would put breakups in there, it would probably even be higher.
I agree.
But still, nevertheless, it does say something to the getting married young and things like that.
I agree. Here's something that blew me away. I think the divorce rates is the most inconsistent thing with the boomer generation, because like everything else about baby boomer generation is stick it out. You're going to keep fighting. If the going gets tough, you get going. But to be the highest rated divorce generation blew me away. I didn't know that. I learned that today.
And I do think it's skewed because of that, because I would like to see the percentages of
breakups and stuff.
Of the breakups and how many people are actually married percentage-wise. You're going to have more, obviously, if you have a lot more are married.
Yeah,
so
it just blew me away.
Here's an interesting stat here. In the 1970s, that's when I was in high school.
Yeah, back in your day.
Back in my day. In the 1970s, just 29% of American adults believed that premarital sex among adults was not wrong at all. In other words, what is it? 71% said
that everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Premarital sex is wrong. 71% would say it was wrong. So 29%, nothing wrong with it all. That number increases to 42% in the 80s, 49% in the 2000s, and 58% between 2010 and 2012. So over half are saying, it's not a big deal. And my guess is today it's even higher than that.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's just from back in 2012.
Exactly.
When I was looking at it, it said 79% didn't view sex, 79% of people 18 and older had sexual relations.
Right.
And so that's just saying.
Now, here's the one thing I would say. In the 70s, just 29% of American adults believed premarital sex among adults was not wrong at all. The other 60% thought it was wrong, but was still doing it.
And you would share that with me, that your generation just was silently having sex.
Exactly. And knew that it was wrong and wasn't going to tell anybody about it. But now it's just open and out there.
Craig Wiley shares, you can't be a divorce statistic if you're never married, which is the truth behind my generation.
Exactly.
And that's part of what we wanted to talk about tonight. We wanted to share all of the data because there is a huge difference in generations. What I've noticed, especially with my peers and with my groups, is that the value of singleness and the value of marriage both have become just kind of just like tossing the winds, where like people are living single just very sexually, and people are dating very sexually, and people are in marriage. I mean, I've got peers that I know of that have multiple people in
This blew me away when you said that.
Yeah, I've got a friend. I've got friends that I know of. Well, people that I associate with. I won't necessarily call them my friends, but people that I know of that have multiple partners in their relationship, and that's a common thing for moving forward in generations.
Yeah.
Is that is it polygamy? Is that what it?
Yes. Let's say it is.
It's becoming and I hate using the word progressive.
An open marriage.
Yes.
It's
open marriage.
okay as long as And that honestly in my day and age would have been unheard of.
Right.
And it would have been would have been tabloid type of deals.
Right.
It's just
part of what we're not going to really be talking about tonight is homosexuality and all of those things, but those are also becoming much more common as the younger generations. That's another topic for another day, because that's big enough in and of itself.
Right.
But marriage is so different. Purity is so different. Divorce is so different. Faithfulness is so different. And what we want to make clear before we go into the second half of the talk tonight, we're not encouraging you to get married. that's part of the ring before spring. What I've hated about AU
Right.
was they would talk about it in chapel.
In our age, I'm going to college so I can get my Mrs. degree.
Right.
You know.
And what we're not saying is, because part of the pressure of the purity culture has been, well, if you want to have sex, then get married. And I don't think that you should get married just to have sex. I think you need to.
And I think that's honestly one of the reasons why in my generation you do see more divorces and things is because it was exactly that is, you are going to get married. If you're going to have sex, you got to get married.
Right.
If someone got pregnant, you got married.
Really?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
And I can remember there was a handful probably in the 4 years that I was in high school that
in high school.
Yeah.
People were getting married.
Got pregnant and would get married.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, that's just so different to me because, nowadays you've got, again, another hot topic with abortion and all that. Like that is such a heavier considered option.
I would be curious if there's anybody out there that is a boomer. If you experience that too, is that something that would just unique?
Yeah, we've got multiple in the chat.
To me, is that do you recall that? Is that if someone got pregnant in your generation back in high school and college, it was just a given that they're going to get married.
Then Gen X, we've got Susan Keys, Craig Wiley. Let us know because we're not talking about Gen X tonight,
right?
But when I was looking at the stats and the whatnot, because they were just comparing generations millennial to boomer, but something they said that was interesting was that Gen X kids grew up for the first time where their parents could be divorced because a lot of boomers grew up in 2-parent households with the silent generation.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back and I'm trying to think of my friends that I ran with.
If you knew of anybody with
I don't know
parents.
of anybody that came from a split family.
Yeah, and started to become more common with Gen X, because so many of their boomer parents started splitting up.
Right.
They would have split families.
Right.
And whatnot.
Interesting.
Craig Wiley, not a boomer, but that happened in my age group. So Craig Wiley talking about the pregnant thing if you got pregnant. And that's part of the Gen X was a slow transition over and whatnot.
Right.
Well, here's the question. Oh, Barb says, or get sent off to aunt's house if pregnant.
Oh, that's so true.
Talk about that because I have no idea what she's talking about.
People, and again, I heard of this. It didn't happen a lot where I went to school because we went to a small country school. Mm-hmm. But exactly, is all of a sudden a girl would disappear.
Really?
And they would be.
They've done that in shows like before.
They would go to someplace else to live so that in the community you wouldn't know. They'd have the baby and they'd come back. Almost. Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah. It was a big black mark on you if you were pregnant in high school
which is so interesting
early college.
You've said that a lot of your generation was just having sex.
Yes.
And then they would judge people. Like, would you judge each other for having sex?
No,
or just for getting pregnant.
You didn't. Just for getting pregnant. You didn't want to get caught.
Interesting. But you all.
And I may be over exaggerating that, but because we laugh about this because we play when we have events at church and things. We always argue about playlist on school on
music,
music and things like that. And I'm always trying to play something 70s rock and roll, and I never realized it until you guys really pointed out that every song is about sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's true.
And my generation, everything's about drugs, alcohol, and stripping down women and stuff.
Yeah, it's just
demoralizing women.
It's just wild.
Yeah. Well, okay, so the question that I want to move on
This was one of those rabbit trails we talked about getting on.
We said we were going to get some rabbit trails. Next question, okay? So the biggest difference that I've seen in our generations is that people don't necessarily get married. And not because they're choosing to stay single, which there's some of my peers do that, but because they're living together but just not married. They're paying bills together but they're just not married. They're having sex but they're just not like why. And they've asked me the question, and some of my friends that I've pushed back on them on. Well, why would we get married if we're if we're living like we're married?
Right.
And that's not the case for your generation.
No.
We saw that.
Right.
What are some of your thoughts on how my generation's done that, and as you've seen that in culture today?
I think my generation looks at it as a lack of commitment. And then we blame you millennials for, you have that in every part of your life. You don't commit to a job. You don't commit to work. You don't commit to marriages. You don't commit. So there's no commitment level whatsoever.
Right.
And so I think from our standpoint, one is we got to be careful with that. Mm-hmm. But there's some truth to that also.
Sure.
But I think even coming from us being pastors from a biblical standpoint, I think there's some important things that we've got talk about and notice that. And we were in a conversation one time with someone, and we talked about infidelity. We talked. See, I said it right that time.
You did. Infidelity is what you said
I wouldn't have said
earlier.
it. I wouldn't have said it that way. Infidelity, and we were talking, and you gave this explanation of purity and the closeness of the intimacy
Yes.
is what I'm looking at. So I would love to hear you talk and maybe
Yeah.
about that a little bit, because I remember after that meeting coming to you and saying, "Man, we have got to preach this sometime."
Right. Yeah. So sex is one of my, that's one of my passionate topics. I know that sounds so weird.
It does sound
but
a
it
little
just
weird.
means
We could not, honestly, we could not have had this discussion in my generation.
Really.
If you would have talked about that, you
That's
would have
so
you would have been
crazy to me.
X-rated.
That's
And-
so crazy to me.
Bruce, would you have done that
Brent, you're
in your
hilarious.
generation? It was good.
Bruce said Gen X was getting worse.
Yeah.
But okay. So yeah. So anyway, purity to me, and one of the reasons is because I believe that sex can not only make or break a relationship, but it can also make or break a person. Like if you're addicted to sex, or if you have a sexual lifestyle, or if you struggle with pornography, and the reason being is because sex or sexual acts, and Paul says this, is the one sin that's outside the body that affects not just you, but directly another person.
Absolutely. You are.
And that's why intimacy is so significant, because when you live a life of sexual impurity, you're not, like Paul says, you're not just sinning against yourself, but you're damaging something permanently. And we don't say that to scare you. Like, don't have sex before marriage because of that. It's just one of those things that it is the consequence for a choice that you've made. Now, again, there is a percentage of people who were victimized and abused, and that's not a choice that they made.
Right.
But, and what's unfortunate is the sin of someone else has damaged you as well.
Right.
Forever.
Right.
So that's why I believe that purity is so stinking important. And in our culture today, we have gotten so far from intimacy, from biblical spiritual intimacy, which we're going to define here in a little bit by but talking through a few verses, where this can literally ruin your marriage. Even you can idolize sex within your marriage.
Right.
If sex needs to be a foundation of your marriage won't last.
Correct.
What happens if your husband or your wife can no longer physically have sex because of an illness or a disease or an injury or whatnot? If that's the foundation of your marriage is
It's
gone.
done.
You know?
Right.
Sex is a blessing from God, and it provides intimacy, but it is not the source of intimacy.
And without understanding that, and without having that basis, you could never have true intimacy.
Absolutely.
And that's why people bounce from place to place to place.
Absolutely.
And there's a piece of them that is broken on
Right.
the inside that they can never satisfy.
Right. And what you have to understand too is this is kind of like a jar, like just a jar with, water or something. Every time you have sex with another soul, again, they talk about two flesh become one. You literally are like sharing your cups of water. Okay. And it's not like you just refill your cup up, to go on to the next person. You have a limited supply of intimacy that you can give.
Right.
Okay. And so then if you go to another soul and you two flesh become one, and that's why so many people, after they continue to have sex with different partners or continue to watch porn psychologically, you literally become so limited in your ability to be intimate that everything just becomes numb. And that's why intimate relationships becomes impossible.
And exactly. And it means nothing.
It means nothing.
It means absolutely nothing.
And that's what's so damaging about sex. And that's why I think sex has been a downfall for churches since the Corinthians back 2,000 years ago.
Right. This is not a new problem.
No, this has just become a digital problem now.
Yes.
And that's part of why it's so scary. You see pastors, you see worship leaders. And this comes back to the fidelity, if your marriage bed or your single bed is not kept pure, it will ruin your life.
Yep.
Period. And you might not think porn is a damaging drug, but it literally is compared to the addiction of heroin and cocaine.
Right.
That's how damaging it is.
How your brain reacts and things like that. Now, that's all depressing.
Yes. Yes.
Because we live in a culture and my guess is there'll be some people listening to this or watching it right now
Yes.
that have stuck in this and I think, I have no hope.
Yeah, or they've had sex before marriage.
Or lots of it with different
Right.
partners and what
Right.
have you. And I want you to understand that God can redeem anything.
Yes, and I don't want you to feel shame right now.
No.
Okay,
That's not
the heart behind
that
this.
is not, and that's what I want to
No,
be careful of.
right.
We have to understand the dangers of this whole thing.
Yes,
but
that's so good.
in
I'm glad you brought that
reality,
up.
the reality is that yes, God can redeem
Yeah.
that.
And that's part of why I think my generation has gone so far the other ways, because of shame and purity culture
Sure.
from the church is and really with most things is when my generation feels pressured and told you can't do something,
We're going to do it.
And we do it to the extreme.
Right.
And so we want you to know, again, we serve a God of redemption,
Right.
a God of hope. And just because something of your past has been the way it is, doesn't mean it always has to be that way.
Right.
Craig shared something that was really powerful. Well, Susan Key said the 80s changed everything. Amen. And then Craig Wiley said it's almost like we should have been more graceful and compassionate with those who fell short of the ideal situation, but not throw out the values with the increase in acceptance. That's so good. That hits on right.
That is exactly correct.
It's the message of grace and truth.
And again, everything is foundational in love.
Right.
You know,
absolutely.
I would say in my generation that was void of that. It's just we got rid of you. If you sinned or if you were sleeping around or what have you, you were just a bad soul and outcast. So I think Craig is exactly right.
Right, and that's what's so important when we talk about marriage, when we talk about purity, when we talk about the culture that we're in, is that we have that understanding that just because you've lived a certain way, okay? And we talk about this in marriage counseling too with different people who are like my mom, Kim, our Next Steps pastor, when she's done marriage counseling and she finds out that the couple has, chosen to sleep together, be intimate together, or even live together, she'll challenge them. She won't say, hey, find another place to live, because that's very unrealistic in a short time.
Right.
But what she'll say is sleep in different rooms.
That's what I counsel people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge step to say, hey, you might have made some choices before. You can still set your marriage up to succeed by choosing a life of purity.
Saying this is so, I want my relationship based so much on God and what He wants for us that I'm going to choose not to have sexual relations until we are married.
Right, I love that. Well, hey, I want to just share 4 verses. If you're looking to dive deeper into what does Scripture say, these 4 verses could all be 4 different topics. We might talk about these, in different times, but this is what we believe is the importance of keeping your purity pure. So what do we believe that God says about marriage? First, Paul says that singleness is better and more rewarding. 1 Corinthians 7. He literally says, I wish you were all like
single.
me, single. Yeah. But if you can't keep it in your pants, honestly, that's what it comes down to.
Exactly.
If you have to have sex,
right?
Okay, then it is better to get married. Okay, but if you are single, there is joy in singleness.
Sure.
And I think that's hard to hear as a single person. Because you're like, married people always tell me just be content and stuff. It's okay to want to be married. Okay. There's nothing wrong in that. Just don't idolize marriage, because what I've known is I know a lot of married people that idolize singleness.
True.
It goes both ways.
It does.
So just enjoy the season you're in, grow in the season you're in, and then learn from it. The second one, marriage. We believe marriage is designed to be between one man and one woman. That's found in multiple places throughout Scripture. That's a topic, homosexuality. And in and of itself, we believe there's so much love to have for that community, but that's just the stance that we take. And we probably will talk about that as a topic down the road, because there really isn't enough time to talk about all these. Third thing, if it all depends on you, don't be divorced. Okay. Matthew 5. Brad, do you want to speak on this at all?
and that's something because as most anybody knows, and if you're watching this and don't know who we are, Barb and I have both been remarried. We have both been divorced, and show you how far the church has even come. The church we started going to after we've been, this will be 28 years. I think that's right, Barb. Hope so. Coming up 28 years. Anyway, the church we went to when we first got married, I wouldn't have been able to serve on a board or anything in the church because I was divorced.
Yeah,
and here I am, how many years later, leading a church, and so that's how far we've come. And again, that's the redemption story, and that's what I got at heart. But I think you would talk to either myself or Barb, and we would say, we should not have been divorced.
Right.
We understand that was not God's plan for either of those marriages to end. And so, but God has done an amazing thing in redemption. And so, turn something out of nothing, brokenness into beauty, stuff like that. God can turn beauty from ashes. Yes.
It's just one of those things where if it all depends on you, Stay committed.
Do whatever
Stay
it takes.
consistent. Yep. Last thing about that, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. Keep the marriage bed pure. This is Hebrews 13:4. This is what's so important. And not just pure, like don't have affairs physically, don't have affairs emotionally, not that stuff alone, but also with pornography and with lusting and with lying and being emotionally detached from your partner. If we can get this right, okay, if we can get that part right, it will revolutionize your relationship.
And your sexual encounters will be at a level that you've never.
Yep. You'll experience true intimacy.
You cannot believe what true intimacy does.
Especially with porn, like we were talking about with the brains. If porn is a part of your relationship or your singleness, you are going to bring that baggage with you into your marriage.
Yep.
And it will change the expectations of sex.
And you know, we've talked about this some too, is a breakdown in this is what our enemy wants.
Absolutely.
Because it's so hard to overcome. It is an addiction.
Yep.
And it ruins everything. So it's no wonder that we're under attack with this all the time.
Yeah.
And it's not because, hey, we're being goody two-shoes. It's just better for your relationship to have that. It's what God had designed a marriage and relationships to be, is this intimate, unbelievable thing, and we have ruined it.
Yeah, I've messed up sexually. I was addicted to porn for 10 years before I got married.
Yeah.
I didn't have sex before marriage, but I did about everything you could imagine before marriage. And I can tell you that there's a better way to live.
Right, exactly.
And it is through biblical, spiritual intimacy with your one partner and with God.
Yep.
So, Brad, why don't you share your final thoughts? I'll share my final thoughts, and then we'll close and, call it a night.
Man, there's so
There's
much
so
here.
much you could close with.
There is so much here. And I think just a 30,000-foot view to me is be intentional.
Ooh, I like that.
You know, just understand that this is not something to play around with or fool around with. This is serious. And I try to tell all my kids, even when they were dating, when they first started dating, is you date to mate.
Yeah.
And you know, we can argue about that sometime also, but it is so serious that be intentional with what you're doing and understand. And if you set yourself up in a godly relationship,
right? And
I've seen people on both ends of that, and you watch the ones that set up in a godly relationship, and it's amazing the difference of what they have in a relationship, and you can see it and sense it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my final thing, and this is something I had wrote down, is if you're single, set yourself up for success by choosing purity. Okay. If you're dating, set yourself up for success by choosing purity. If you're married, set yourself up for success by, guess what it is?
Purity.
Choosing purity.
Yeah.
Okay. Whatever stage of life you're in, there's grace, there's hope. Like you said, there's redemption. You don't have to feel shame.
No.
God does not use shame.
And I don't think we can emphasize that enough, because there is grace, and
that's the heart of this conversation.
Exactly.
But the truth of the matter is, there's a better way.
Yep, absolutely.
So, hey, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a fun conversation. Thanks for engaging, for tuning in. We had 12 people watching the whole time on a tough topic and a cool topic, a good topic. And so we're so glad that you tuned in, that you joined us and whatnot.